The Waterworks Commission meeting. Welcome. Noting that we have one absence, but otherwise we have a quorum here. So thank you for joining us. The first item on our agenda is to approve the minutes of our July 6th, 2021 meeting. I would entertain a motion. I have a motion by Herbst, second by Robinson. Any discussion here? I am not seeing any. All of those in favor can signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, that passes unanimously. Thank you. We are moving on to item number 2, the director's report. I'll pass it over to you, Mr. Lindman.
Yeah, so the first 3 items are some things that we're going to be working on. And in particular, the asset management, just to give you an overview, that's something that was in the budget for this year that we're going to start pursuing. We're going to start talking to some asset management companies. Eventually, we will prepare an RFP for that work and type of software that we need once we can kind of narrow down what our goals are for that software, and then do an RFP, and then hopefully get some good responses and update the commission at that point in time as we move forward. The RFP for proposals for lead service line replacement plan, which the DNR is going to require. We're going to go out for RFP on that. To get a consultant on board to help us put that plan together. That will also come back to the commission for your review. And there's an update on the private lead service line replacements for this year. If you look at the details on that Scott put in the director's report, the data, 720 letters have gone out. And 49 estimates have been received, 32 replacements. So that was one of the DNR's biggest to-dos, was that, the money that you request, you need to spend it. Or there's potentially that we won't have the opportunity to request more for 2022. So cautiously optimistic, I guess, but the percentages are pretty low right now.
Looks like Mr. Robinson has a question or comment.
Well, I have a couple, but I'm specifically in that. So we had 720 letters that went out. How was the interest shown? So we had 239 that expressed interest, but only 32 that basically signed up.
The way we've been running the program is that we send the letters, and then we request that they call us to make an appointment to verify their service material. And once their service material is verified lead, and then we provide them with the information for the program, the numbers for the plumbers, explain the program to them so we don't have any issues on the front end before they get involved.
So of the 239 that expressed interest, how many had lead?
I don't have that number here. I mean, it was probably probably a handful, maybe less than a handful, that did not have lead.
So could we say 200 of the 239 had lead, more?
That would probably be an accurate
So how do we then move from 200 with lead to 32, you're running 16% replacement. So how do we get to a point where we get a higher level of replacement? We're out there, we're doing the work. Is it education? Is it incentives? It just begs the question of, there are economies of scale when we're doing the work. So how do we increase the performance and replacement rate?
require it.
Yeah, right now they have the option. They don't have to replace it. So
that leads me into my second point. So then, as you look at the RFP for the services, as I look at that lead service line replacement, I think that the components to it are, obviously the inventory. I look at what Green Bay did, and they basically brought together a team, and, it's developing that communication strategy that includes health and others. But then we get into the permitting, the funding, is it grants, is it application, is it community development block grant, is it ARPA dollars? Is it something else? What are the legal ramifications relative to the mandatory replacement? And then ultimately, we're into the contracting and the restoration. Will the RFP address all of those issues and present us at the end of the day with a plan on how we're going to inventory, communicate, bring in the partners, roll through the funding? You identified many of those in your report to us.
Yes, so the RFP will include that, proposals will need to include all of those.
Okay.
And so that's what we will, need assistance with, for an outside vendor to help us out with those people that have had experience, doing this type of work and preparing these.
I think one of the issues, though, in the communication plan is to make sure that we involve partner agencies, and, I think that's a role. Green Bay did it after the Flint, Michigan scare, and, I think that we have the ability to leverage the health department and others from the perspective of lead in the pipes and the public health concern associated with that. So I'd encourage whoever the vendor is to think potentially outside the traditional box.
Okay. Make sure it's in there.
Ms. Herbst, can you turn your mic on? I get yelled at when you don't.
I'm so sorry. Eric, I don't remember, do we have to have that money, the balance, spent by the end of this year?
Yes. Yep.
Thank you, that's what
We
I
have
thought.
not reached out to the DNR to see if there, is any possibility. We didn't get approved, I don't think, until March, April of this year. Is that when the first letters went out, Scott, in the spring?
Right now, we're actually operating on a verbal approval.
Yeah, okay. Which is part of the challenge, we're telling people that this money's out there, but they've told us we have it, but we don't have it in writing. But if we waited for it in writing, we still wouldn't have letters out, so, yeah.
Mr. Jean?
In the case of Green Bay, did they have mandatory ordinance for replacement when they did that program?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, okay.
They put one in place, yep.
Any other questions on this, or do you want to keep rolling? Okay. I don't know if you want to highlight anything else.
Just on regular operations as well as the water and wastewater treatment facility updates. If anyone has any questions specific to those operations that we're doing.
Mr. Robinson?
But I don't on those, but I do on the locates in the hit water line. So what happens? Did we do the locate where the hit occurred, and then what happens when the hit does occur and the damage is done to the?
Well,
to the line?
typically we'll, get a call with the water lines. The sewer lines, we're not always sure if they hit them because we don't necessarily get the leaks, but it's the responsibility of the contractor that's out there. The challenge is that the contractors that are out there, they don't necessarily have the crews or the expertise to do the repairs. And so they end up going up to engineering, and then our crews go out there, they take a look at it. They can do the repair, and then that cost will be charged back. But typically what we'll do is we'll contract that work out.
Do we charge a premium for that?
We charge what the contractor charges us.
Do we charge a premium for that? Should we charge a premium for that? We've done the locate, they've come to us, we've done the locate. The locate is done through whatever reason they don't do that. We're struggling with getting the locates done. It's creating a work burden on us when we do the locates, and then they don't adhere to the information that's given to them in the field relative to the placement of the pipes, and they breach our pipes. It creates, I'm sure our costs are not all inclusive of the time of engineering and others. Should there be a premium for work that is done underground that damages our our lines?
We can certainly look into it. From a legal perspective, I'm not sure what we're able to charge as far as a premium, and then I guess we could try to quantify our hours in engineering, staff time and everything else, even if it is contracted out. Yep. Right now, we're having an issue with, just as an example, a storm sewer that was hit last year. It was in a major intersection. It was about a $60-some thousand repair. Of course, the contractor, it was Charter, they went to their insurance company. Now, the insurance company only is saying that they're going to pay a portion of it. And so we're going through that battle at this point right now, so, yeah.
Do we have the ability to hold up future permits, right-of-way permits,
I would-
based upon their non-payment of damages?
I think we do. I mean, we've, with support from this commission, I mean, we've held up TDS's permits, until they've completed others, just because the locates were getting out of hand for our staff. So I think we can do that. Like Charter and the existing ones, they don't have a lot of permits every year, but we can certainly do that, yep. Which is actually a good idea.
Mr. Jean?
Under item 2 of the wastewater, can we have a status of the qualification for the person that they hope to offer a job to, or I think they've offered a job and just trying to finalize that? Does anybody have that information?
I don't know where that's at. I don't know, Tony, if you've heard back from that individual. Thank you.
This is for our one sewer vacancy.
That's correct, yeah.
I'm actually hoping to meet with you after this meeting so we can establish an amount.
Okay, all right, okay.
Mr. Jean?
Yes. Do you recall the qualifications of the gentleman? Did he work in a wastewater setting or similar?
I don't believe that this individual had previous sewer experience, although I will kind of preface that with, I haven't looked closely at the resume yet, so I could be horribly mistaken.
So who interviewed the gentleman? Was he interviewed?
Yes, he was interviewed by the sewer department.
Okay.
And Jennifer Cannonberg on my staff helped moderate that interview, although I don't believe she served as a rater.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions, comments on the director's report? Mr. Robinson?
Could I just ask that, as it relates to the permits for, that we get a report at a future meeting with our options relative to that penalty provision and,
Yeah, will do. Yep, absolutely, John.
See the attorney taking a note too, so, thanks. All right, with that, we will move on to item number 3, discussion and possible action on a solar agreement with WPS. Maybe before we have any action, want to give us a little update on where we at?
Yeah. We had so this has come a couple different times. So last month, the numbers that we were looking at, we were using the purchase of 1.5 million kilowatt hours annually from the NatureWise program. I sat down with WPS. Jeff is on WebEx with us, and then Dave Schneider is here. And we went through those agreements, which are in the packet, and drafted those. WPS said that we could drop that to 1 million, purchase a minimum of 1 million, which basically made those costs come back in similar. So whether we did it on our own or whether we partnered with WPS. I will say, though, that there are assumptions that are being made in those costs. We're assuming that the premium rate will not go down. There's strong suggestions from WPS that over time that premium rate will go down. There's a potential for some sort of carbon tax on how we're purchasing power now that could make our rates go up. And when we were with our power, we were assuming, I think it was near like 900,000 kilowatt hours we would be selling back to WPS. We don't know I'm not sure that I am 100% confident with that number, just based on possibly where our peaks will be. And so those are assumptions that we're making currently, that, you know, we having a difficult time quantifying. But as of right now, with those assumptions, as you can see on the chart, our costs are similar over a 30-year period with those assumptions. Our lease for the property will be about $800 an acre per year. So it really, I mean, at that cost, it doesn't have a significant impact on, you know, over the 30-year period.
Do you want to have a, Mr. Jean?
But then we don't have to put any capital outlay. And what is that number? Was it projected at 3 million or?
2.6 or something.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Yeah, it was a little over 2.5 million,
Okay, then the other question, so we don't have to have the capital outlay.
correct?
So, but the other thing, what was the number that we would be selling back in kilowatts? Did you say?
900,000, is that right, Lisa? I think that was the assumed amount. Yep.
Mr. Robinson?
So I still don't know that I have the information that I need to vote on this. You know, the concerns that I have is that we have two options before us, and I think there's at least a third and potentially more. And the third option is to do nothing. And that's just continue with status quo. You know, my concern is that we're assuming that we have either we do it, they do it. If they do it, we buy back at a premium the energy through nature-wise. And what's the difference between if we just go ahead and continue to operate as is? I think that there's incentives and pressure on the utilities to get cleaner in terms of their generation of power. And I'd like to see a pro forma that gives us at least those comparisons. And I don't know if there are other options out there, but I'm not sure that at this time I'm ready to do it. You know, the concerns is that we've got a 20-year agreement. Nature-wise, we've got a 30 plus 5 plus 5, so a 40-year agreement on the lease of the property. There are exclusive rights and there are non-exclusive rights and other things, and I would hope that the attorneys would look through those provisions to make sure that we do what's in the best interest of the utility and the city in the context of those. But I guess what I'd like to know is just with the do-nothing option, you know, what would that cost us? My concern is that inherent in the actions that were taken in the past relative to the upgrading of the facilities, that we are creating a significant financial burden on many low-income people. And anywhere that we can minimize those impacts, and if it includes a do-nothing option, we need to evaluate those going forward. And that's what's sort of driving my concern. I am very concerned about carbon impacts and footprints, but there's also the ability of affordability on the part of low, moderate income individuals.
Lisa, do you happen to know, because I know there was a couple different times we just kind of did the baseline.
You
Yeah,
might have to step to the mic, though.
yeah, I don't know if you have that with you. I don't remember what that was. I didn't bring it with me either.
Yeah, we had done a baseline initially, and I think, and there's been many iterations since then, so don't quote me on it, but I think at the time when we were looking at it, that was the cheapest option, or the you know, the less expensive out of all three. But we'd have to look at it with our new
Right.
assumptions and all the data again.
You know, I think the other thing with the do-nothing option is, you know, the industry itself is going towards this. This is how the utility is generating power. And so, you know, if there is additional taxes on the power that we're using right now, we will see those. If there is other incentives coming down the road for doing this, the premiums going down and so on and so forth. You know, for me, I feel this is the right direction to go. But if the commission isn't comfortable at this point, we'll definitely bring more information back, because I definitely think it's worth the effort to try to show that this is the direction we should go. So I guess the one of clarification, John, like on the pro forma, the details, like when you talk about a pro forma, you're talking about the 3 different options, the do nothing and the 2 that we're looking at, correct? And then,
There may be variations of each.
Okay.
Based upon assumptions. You've
Yeah.
got assumptions that say, carbon tax, assumptions that the nature-wise is more expensive, those costs might come down. Are there ways to tweak that pro forma to look at what those scenarios might be? And again, I don't disagree with your desire to do this. I think it's something we ought to strive to do, but I also really am concerned, because I'm starting to hear comments on the street about the utility rates. And we're just in starting that process of the rate increases. We're not through it.
Mr. Jean?
The baseline, is that, when you said you did the baseline, was that based on also including that we don't do anything?
That was the baseline, was that we
That
just,
represents the baseline.
yeah, that you just continue to purchase power from WPS as you have been.
And repeat what you said before about that. I didn't.
We had done the baseline in the very initial stages of this, and then at some point, we kind of dropped it and just compared the utility-owned versus the nature-wise program. So I'd have to bring those numbers kind of up into, where we've gotten to with the rest of it, which I could do. I mean, that's not a problem. It just needs to be looked at again.
at the time, Joe, it was, if everything stayed status quo, then that was the cheapest option, to
Correct.
stay with what we have. Yep. Based on the assumptions that nothing would change.
Well, then, John, based on your comments, should we look at that first before we try to make a decision, period? Or do you want to look at other things?
I'd like to look at what the range of options is, because otherwise we get to a point where we say, well, that's nice, what about this? And so it would be nice to get that, sort of an options report, if you will. If you do this, this is what the cost is. If they're close, I think we ought to go with the solar. If they're not close, then we have to evaluate and do the trade-offs. But we need that information to make the decision.
Okay.
Mr. Jean?
Well, do we need to put on hold what we did, our action last meeting? Didn't we authorize to go on our own?
I think the motion at the last meeting was to go on our own, but to continue to
Look for
evaluate
partnerships.
partnerships and opportunities to
Yep.
work together, and I think this is consistent with that.
I think so too.
No.
I think also looking at funding sources for this, obviously we're hearing about the infrastructure bill, things like that. We can look at those options, maybe even what we're getting already. So, any further discussion on this that we'd like to?
So we have WPS and Jeff from WEC here too, if you have specific questions for them.
Or if there's
Or
any
comments,
clarification they'd like to
yep,
share.
right.
I know last time we didn't specifically ask, but, yeah. If you could just state your name for the record.
Sure. My name is Dave Schneider. I think it would be prudent for everyone at this point to have WPS sit down with Clark Dietz and make sure that we understand the assumptions that were made.
Yep.
I think that's critical.
Okay.
So I'm hopeful that within the next month, we can certainly do that and come back to you guys and give you some answers.
That would be great, I think, in all of our opinions.
Okay.
Thank you. Good. Okay, I think we are ready to move on unless any last minute comments on this. Okay. Moving on to item number 4, discussion and possible action on recruitment and retention for utility employees. I think both Mr. Lindman and Ms. Vanderboom have things to share on this, so maybe we can chat about this before we,
Yeah, so we've talked about this with the vacancies that we've had at the wastewater facility with, we've had some retirements and, we anticipate some other retirements here within the next 18 to 24 months that, could potentially cause, some succession issues. And so, trying to be proactive on that, looking at some of the challenges that we've had in the past, just the past couple of years, as well as the last 4 or 5 that I've outlined in my memo. And also, moving forward, trying to maintain our compliance with regulations that are coming down, both wastewater and water, and to meet those requirement deadlines as well. And so, obviously, we have maintenance that's been delayed because of staffing issues. It will be some time before we get caught up on that. And so, one of the biggest things from my standpoint that I've seen is that our job description minimum requirements have gone down since I've been here. So we're at the very minimum. Then we train these individuals, they become good employees, they become proficient at their position in 3 to 4 years, and then they're trained. They can go somewhere else and make more money. They can go somewhere else and do other things, have more advancement, but we are unable to bring them to market. So with how our wages are set right now and our scale and structure, if they come in at the minimum, it will take them 8 years to meet market rate, which becomes a challenge. We become essentially a training ground. And I think the retention, should be the focus. The recruitment, I think, is we can get people in the door, maybe not as many as applications that we want, but we can get people in the door. But we want to keep them, and we want to get them paid to where they need to be. So that's our significant concern, and then it's succession planning for the retirements and the long-term employees that will be leaving. And, how do we fill those gaps now so that there's a smooth transition when they do leave us into retirement. And so I think one of the ways that we can do that, and probably the most efficient and the best way, is to have options through a consultant to walk us through some different options. They can look at other utilities. They can provide us, based on our organization and structure, what would be the best way to do this. And this is not in line with what the city is doing, because the city does wage studies every 5 years. And so, the last one was implemented in 19, so this would be sooner than what the city is moving ahead with, so. But I think we're in a situation right now that could become very critical very quickly.
did you want to share any, give any kind of background on what how the city moves forward with these kinds of projects?
Sure. I think we've got a couple of things that we can talk about. If our concern is most, our issue is most with retention, the memo that I gave you guys, I pulled retention information and hiring information. So why people are turning down offers and also why they're separating. Now, when I pulled retention numbers, I didn't pull retirements because retirement is a cyclical retention issue. And retirement is actually a good thing. It means that somebody has been with your organization and they spent their career with you, and now they're getting able to happily enjoy their retirement times. So what we look at is why we're losing people before they're retirement eligible, because those are the folks that we want to hold on to. And when we don't consider retirement, your retention issues, your retention number or your turnover numbers really aren't increasing significantly. So you guys usually lose from the utilities as a whole due to resignations, a person here or there a year. And right now, you're losing 2 people a year. So it's really not that significant of a change when it comes to retention. But I did give you the information on why we're losing those folks. Some background information as far as for how the city goes about, well, the city's compensation plan. So after Act 10, the city hired a vendor to basically say, now that we're not subject to union contracts, how are we going to pay folks? How are we going to move them through the salary scale? And they had a vendor come in and they established salary grades. We figured out which positions are equivalent to each other. They established where market was, and at that point, the vendor, which was Whipfleet, established that there would be a 20% spread. Market would be in the middle, and people could be hired as low as 20% below market and as high as 20% above market. We have the ability, depending upon someone's experience, to hire anywhere from that minimum to midpoint. And if we want to go above midpoint, we just need the mayor's signature and approval to let us go above that. So what we do when we have a candidate who comes in and we want to hire them is we take a look at their experience. If they just meet the minimums, then usually we recommend we start them at the starting salary because they need that training and experience. If someone has applicable experience that we want to give them credit for, we have the ability to start them higher than minimum. So for example, with our candidate that we were talking about, if we had someone who was coming in as let's say a plant mechanic, and they have mechanic experience that's helpful to us, usually Eric and I sit down and we try to figure out how helpful is that experience, how much credit do they deserve to get for that. If they've worked at a previous municipality, or if they've worked for us before, well, that's usually exactly what we're looking for, and they get almost year for year credit for that. If it's a little bit less helpful, they get less credit and so on. And so then we have the ability to hire somebody higher up in the salary range. So if you have credit, you can get to market at the time of hire, or you can earn your way to market faster based on that previous education or experience. The city, according to the employee handbook, conducts a market study every 5 years. The city started the wage study before I was hired. They did an RFP in 2016. In 2017, we chose a vendor. We did the work for the wage study in 18, and it was implemented in 19. So, and with that vendor, what they do is they take jobs. You can't compare every single job to market because it would be very, very slow and very, very expensive. So usually what they do is they identify benchmark jobs. So that they pull out at least one job per department, also one job per salary grade, and we look for market equivalencies for those positions, and then that information is extrapolated out across the salary grade. So, for example, you could take HR director and you'd compare and see what market rate is for that, as well as other positions in my salary grade. And they do a very complicated statistical process to kind of establish the market benchmark that we use moving forward. So,
Any questions for, Mr. Jean?
How many employees in the utility have been hired at the market or above?
I don't believe anyone in the utility has, and there has been a disinclination within the utility managers to hire somebody over your internal incumbents. So what happens is, if you have someone, a new hire, who's going to jump over and pay a current employee, at this point the superintendents have been hesitant to do that because it can cause some morale issues inside the department. So at this point they're not fully utilizing that flexibility in the city's pay scale because of internal equity concerns.
I'm kind of getting the impression that maybe we should review the scales so that wouldn't be an issue. And maybe what we need to do is compare how we stack up with other utilities. If I go to state meetings this year, I am going to check and see how those utilities are paid and get some, we need to get some information, because we have an $80 million investment at the wastewater treatment plant, and I'm scared to death we're not going to be in position to take that over with our staff. Some things have to change.
Sure, I mean, your
And
current
we also have
staffing
40 million,
levels.
we also have 40 million investment at the water. And I don't even want to serve on this commission if we don't have it adequately staffed and with qualified people. That's critical. It's paramount that we take care of this. And just so your understanding, do you do exit interviews with retirement people?
We do not with retirees.
You should. I've had some come up to me. And I did not ask them anything.
Sure.
They came up to me. In fact, I know I saw him at Krieger's, and I wished him well, and then I was going to ask him some questions, and I elected not to. The next time I saw him, he spilled his guts to me. And it's scary. We need to address this, and we can't, I'm sorry, it is not, I don't think we're where we need to be.
Sure.
I'm scared that we need to get qualified people in those positions. And I know there's retention, good quality, ample, but we also need succession planning.
Yeah, definitely. And based on your current staffing levels, right now the utilities have a single vacancy, and we have a candidate, an offer ready to be extended for that position. So when we're talking about current staffing levels, the utility isn't currently shorthanded. But we do need to plan proactively for retirements and be prepared for that turnover that's coming. No individual has been hired for the utilities that hasn't met the minimum qualifications that are established in the job descriptions. And so that is something that every hire is held against. So if those minimum qualifications aren't meeting the utilities' needs, that would be something that we would need to look at. My caution would be that a minimum qualification is intended to identify what it says, the least that somebody needs in order to be successful for the job. It's not intended to describe the ideal candidate to fill that position. And that's because people develop over their time with us, and we want to account for that. Water has done a really excellent job in identifying candidates that have the right work ethic and trainability that we're looking for, and then taking those folks and turning them into the skilled workforce that we need. It's a luxury that's easier to do when you haven't had a lot of turnover like Sewer had because of the retirements. It's easier to work up and train up a single individual than it is a whole department like we had experienced with the retirement turnover in Sewer about a year ago. And I do think that it's important that we continue to compare to market. That is something that the city has a mechanism to do. My concern is that if we establish a different structure for utility versus the rest of the city, what's going to happen for the health of the rest of the city? We've experienced it a little bit post Act 10, where Act 10 applied to everybody but police, fire, and transit. And so we've created there's a morale issue as far as like first and second tier employees, where some individuals get a whole lot of benefits and are advancing at a different rate than others, and it creates a disparity, and it really negatively impacts the team morale of all cities as a whole. And I don't want to see that extend even farther to the utilities versus streets, for example. These two divisions of DPW, and if you guys are set on a structure that advances differently, and then it's going to be a whole lot of bleeding from DPW to Sewer, and then what's going to happen to DPW, and also fiscally what will happen, because perhaps you have the mechanism to do so with this small group of employees. That's the luxury that the city doesn't have to extend when we're going to make it available to everybody. So those are the difficulties that we're balancing when we look as the city as a whole, that I understand isn't exactly part of your peer review here, but that I would ask you to remain kind of cognizant of, because we're all part of the same team here. And I want to make sure that we put together a mechanism that can help everybody and not help one group maybe to the detriment of another group. We are planning on issuing a RFP. So the wage study, I kind of walked you through how long it took last time. Part of that was because the HR department had quite a bit of turnover. We already have a calendar in place so that we can ideally RFP and conduct a wage study at the 4-year mark so that it's ready to be implemented either at or before the 5-year mark. So our hope is to issue an RFP and then do the work on the wage study in 2023. If it can be budgeted appropriately, we could then consider whether the city can afford to implement it immediately or whether we'd have to wait to the 5-year mark to implement. One of the things that we've been working on trying to figure out how to do is what we want that wage study to look like. What conditions we want to include in the RFP to make sure that it's meeting our needs. And one of the things that Eric's brought up that I think is an important criteria is that we need to establish what we want that wage study to do, particularly for utilities. Like how we want to make sure that it compares to this particular market. Now, our last wage study was a combination of public and private. So the wage study didn't just look at government jobs, it looked at private jobs as well, but it did look at government jobs. And I apologize, I don't have before you exactly which jobs in the utility it particularly looked into, but I could get that if anybody's interested. But I think if we want, we can establish some more stringent criteria for the utilities. We want it to compare to this particular number of utilities. We want it to, what kind of things we're looking at establishing. One of the things we're struggling with is how we want that RFP to be worded. I think one of the items that we want it to look at is that 20% above and below market spread. So one of the things that I hear all the time for the wage study is that when we were under the union, we got to market a lot faster. And one of the issues to keep in mind with that is that, yes, that is true, but at the union, you got at market and you capped and you stayed there. We didn't have the 20% above market spread. So fiscally, if we get people to market faster, does that mean we're going to have to shrink people's top pay? If we do that, what do we do to all the people who are currently at top pay? What do we do with the people who are redlined? I mean, there's a lot of moving parts to this that I think an outside vendor would be, as part of our wage study, would be very helpful in doing. My main concern is just if we have dueling wage studies that implement different pay structures throughout the city, what that's going to do for the city's overall pay structure.
I will say I also have that concern as somebody who has to oversee both this utility and the city. It is really important. So thanks for laying it out there. Yeah, Mr. Jean.
I couldn't agree more, but we need some critical things to happen for the utility and to maintain these facilities. And somehow, some way, maybe we rewrite the job descriptions and they're paid at a higher rate. I don't know, but we need to have qualified people in position when the contractors turn over the keys to us. So I would behoove HR to work with, if we don't want to go out independently, I think we need to figure out some creative things to happen so that we are in place when that happens. And it would be nice to have them before the keys are turned over, because they go through a training program with the equipment, with the vendors. And we need to have the people that are going to run those facilities in place to be part of that training. It's adamantly extremely.
I suspect this might be an issue. This is something that Eric and I have talked about informally, is a planning for upcoming retirements and what we're going to do. And there's a possibility that you guys might be seeing some items before you where we're asking for permission to fill anticipated retirement positions before they come vacant so that we can get some of that needed overlap. So we are trying to keep that in mind, especially for some of the higher level retirements that we might know are coming up. Quits are harder to plan for. They are, and that's one of the reasons why my report kind of focused on those reasons. Retirements, we usually get a little bit more notice and we can plan for a little bit more aggressively. But I'm going to be honest, our selection process is lengthy. And if someone gives us 3 months notice and they have to give notice to a current employer, sometimes we're hard pressed to get that person in before the retiree is gone. So I would encourage supervisors and superintendents to speak to their employees so that if someone's willing to share plans so that we know about them way farther in advance than you think we would need to, because between the 3-week posting period and interviews and pre-employment medicals and then notice to employer, we're usually looking at 2 to 3 months.
Mr. Robinson? Oh,
Well, I'm looking at the numbers and, I'm torn because, first of all, I support a uniform approach within the city. But I think there's a desire to make sure that we've got the right amount of talent applying and that we also create opportunities for diversity. And those sometimes run counter to each other, but I would, maybe one of the options there is to look at another tier or a different entry level to encourage that diversity in the training within. But I'm concerned about the length of time to get to the market rate. But I'm also, when I begin to look at it, you had 10 applicants, 13, 12, 18, 15, 11, and the last 2 recruitments, 4. So we're not recruiting, we're not getting the applicants in, and we're in an ever-tightening workforce. So I think it is in the city's interest to reevaluate its policies and its placement in that marketplace sooner than later. This isn't the traditional economy. There is a shortage of jobs. People like me are retiring, and there aren't the replacements. So you need to be competitive, and you need to rethink both how to recruit, what level do you bring them in at? Do you want to create more opportunities to expand diversity? And how do you advance them within a reasonable period of time? And I think that it's important that we understand that there's a tighter workforce. We're not recruiting as many candidates. That's a concern in all areas. And how do we do that? How do we make sure that we're getting the right applicants and the talented applicants to apply?
We've got a new videographer on staff, and so we've actually just started a really exciting project creating some recruitment videos for our really difficult to fill positions. Unfortunately, right now, utilities haven't been carved out for the first round of recruitment videos. We have some city departments that have been accepting applications for a long time that are holding vacancies and don't have candidates, so those groups are getting the first attention. But once that's done, we're planning on having that individual loop back around and do informational videos about the job opportunities that we have in all departments, but especially utilities, to kind of let people know the work that's available, what it's like, and to market why we're a good place to work. What we're finding for especially the entry-level laborer type positions, that the biggest barrier currently is that CDL. And I think that's one of the reasons that drives the main difference in recruitment numbers between water and sewer, is that water has worked to give people time to get that CDL, whereas for sewer recruitments, it's required at time of hire. Each department is positioned differently and has different needs. But I think if we can get creative in areas like that, that we'll probably see an increase in applicants.
Mr. Jean?
I didn't see your memorandum
Sure.
in our packet in advance, so I haven't had the benefit, so if I got a little growly,
No,
I didn't get to see this. But I'm not, I still think we need to be sure that we have the staff in place when we need to have it, and it's coming up very, very quickly. And I don't think we can wait. The utility cannot wait, in my eyes, for the formal study for everybody. So somehow, some way, we need to put that in place, or work some creative magic to make it work.
Well, I think a consideration too is that if the departments are so lean that a single vacancy means that an essential function doesn't get done, perhaps we're too lean. Because FMLA happens. People get sick, there's a pandemic, stuff happens, and people go on vacation and the citizens still want their sewer to work or their water to run in the houses. So, I think that we've taken some admirable long-term steps to try to increase staffing levels. and that will help as well. But yeah, we need to be proactive about upcoming vacancies to make sure that we can address them in a timely manner. And if we need some overlap, put some provisions in place that might let that happen.
I also think that for our skilled labor force, we really need to focus in on trying to figure out a way to get them to market, whether that's through skill tests, practical tests, whatever that is. You know, after they've been working with us for a certain amount of time, we set up criteria that they need to meet, that they test on, and then if they are proficient at their basic job duties, then we should be able to advance them. I think that's one thing that's missing in our wage structure, is that once you come on, you are stuck every year. That's all you get. There is no mechanism to bring them up. There's no, there is nothing else, you know, to bring them up if we have. The best we can do is a DPI, and at basically 3%, you know, and that is, I don't know, it's just, it's not, you know, it's not efficient, it's not adequate. In our skilled labor force, we need to acknowledge these employees that are able to do this work and bring them to where they need to be paid
I
for
will say,
retention.
I'm empathetic to that. I wasn't in skilled labor, but every job I've ever held in a professional setting, I've never held for 8 years. It's been 6 years, it's been 7 years. It's not long-term like that, though. So waiting 8 years to get up to the market is maybe something we should consider.
You're the person we study for retention about why do we keep losing these people?
Yeah.
I don't stay for 8 years.
Yeah, I don't.
And there is an interesting kind of generational shift that we're experiencing in that folks don't stay with their first employer anymore. And, you know, so I think it's curious to see. We do have, like Eric mentioned, we have the discretionary performance incentive program, which is a mechanism wherein directors can recognize employees who are doing a great job. There's a couple of different ways. There's a lump sum bonus, there's a base building increase, vacations, gift cards, all sorts of things that are outlaid in that program. Increases are currently capped at 4.5%, but we try to keep people on steps, because if you get an increase that lands you off step, then your next increase, your annual increase ends up being kind of reduced. We do have one thing that we haven't been able to do in the past that I'm hoping, so in case you can't tell from the 4 years it took to do the last one, wage studies are a lot of work. And they're usually pretty rocky to implement as well. And the city has a kind of sordid history of failed wage study implementations, where we'll pay for a wage study and it doesn't get done, or we pay for a wage study and it only gets partially implemented. And but in the handbook annually, HR is keeping track of kind of inflation, and because of all of the ups and downs with the wage study, that's been a provision in the handbook that's been underutilized, that I'm hoping with a little bit more stability we can start to actually give that its due justice. A lot of that depends on budget and all sorts of other concerns that, you know, are varying in nature. So another issue that we have with discretionary performance incentive program currently is that the language says you can give a discretionary performance incentive if it's within the budget established by the city council. And city council hasn't established a dedicated budget for employee recognition. So what happens is, you can only give a DPI if you have salary savings in your existing city budget. So departments that don't have vacancies, like for example, water currently doesn't have a vacancy, they wouldn't have any salary savings, and then their hands are tied for giving discretionary performance incentives. About 2 years ago, I had asked a supplemental budget adjustment to give a dedicated budget, but it was a hard budget year and it didn't pass. I plan to submit that again, so that smaller departments and departments that don't have vacancies still have an opportunity to recognize individuals monetarily instead of just with time off. Because if you don't have a vacancy, all you can give is time off.
Mr. Jean?
I'm going to ask Scott or Eric or you, Tony. when we've had, for the applicants for jobs for the utilities, have we ever attracted anybody from other utilities? I'm talking public utilities within this Midwest, or not Midwest, but within northern Wisconsin.
We have, I can think of one individual who actually ended up getting a promotion to run a separate utility who's actually on our retention spreadsheet. So we stole someone away, and then they left to take an advancement opportunity, someone else a couple years later, five. Well, it can't be 5, because I remember hiring him 3 years later.
Well, that's Mr. Bloom, and what seems odd, we're the largest utility in metropolitan area in this area, and we're not able to attract people from the smaller. We need to figure this out, because I'd love to come and work for the city of Wausau.
Sure.
If I was working for, and had the qualification. So there's gonna be something, and there's all kinds of reasons why people don't apply for the jobs, because they gotta drive, or they got relocate, or whatever it might be, but, there's something not quite connecting here, so we need to figure that out, and hopefully we can do that very quickly.
Yeah, we rarely do recruitments, external recruitments for advancement opportunities. So that might be something that's coming to play. We mostly recruit externally for our entry-level positions. And so, it's possible that those individuals were hoping to go from being a street guy to a lead or something like that, which we usually reserve those positions to recognize our internal people who are doing a good job and need to move up. So, that could be one of many things that could be coming into play. Like you said, there's so many reasons why people don't apply for jobs. Yes.
I would just like to offer probably a real-world example of why we would like to do this in a little more timely fashion than what is anticipated for the city. Right now, on the water side, I have 3 techs. One position was approved and filled last year on this premise that the 2 incumbent technicians that we have are due to retire within the next 2 years. One I just talked to, he said maybe a year, maybe a little longer. The other has verbally obligated himself until we're in a new plant, but not saying that that can't change. We've hired a new tech. We brought him on. He's very educated, very well into the maintenance field. He's a master electrician, has a lot of experience, does some tool and die, has built machines. Very qualified, very intelligent individual. Currently, he's actively pursuing a new position. He's looking for different employment because he feels the wage is not going to be brought up in a timely manner, and he's probably about $6 to $7 underpaid right now. We luckily acquired this individual during COVID when he was out of a job. Right now, he likes what he's doing, but can pursue another job, making more money if something else opens up. So in a year and a half, when the other 2 techs retire and he finds a new job, we're going to probably pay 4 to 5 times more than we're paying for those 3 techs to outsource the work. Water is different than planning a gathering or chalk fest. It needs to be done, and if we have to do the work, we're going to have to outsource the work, and that's going to come at a higher cost. I think we need to do something faster than 24 or 2024 for implementation.
We had heard that it's difficult to advance somebody above their current peers. Can you sell that to the staff to figure that out?
Well, I think the example in Tony's memo, and I'd have to look back through to be word for word, but we use the CDL as a mechanism to bring somebody in at a higher wage. I think starting a new employee at a higher rate just because they have a CDL and paying them more than the person that's training them with the CDL that's been with us for a year or 2 years is going to cause issues, and I don't agree that that's the way we should go down the road. If they have 5, 6, 7, 10 years of municipal experience on a water utility or a pipeline crew, that would be reason to bring them in at a higher rate. But I can't see bringing somebody in with no experience and paying them more than the person that's going to train them.
But the gentleman you'd like to pay more money to, could we sell that to the staff?
We could. With his peers are making more. And his question to me was, when, I don't know everything here yet, but when I know everything here in a year, how do I make as much money as those guys? And I said, well, wasn't the plan presented to you? And he hadn't seen our pay scale. He didn't realize that it was going to be a 17-year overall pay plan. He was brought in at a higher rate in the beginning because he does have some background in education, but he is not going to reach what his peers are making.
So we don't have a mechanism in our system to allow that, to have him to be equal to pay at least?
Not in a short time period, no.
Yeah, so the pay scales have been designed to recognize longevity. So when Act 10 happened and Whipley came in, the city got rid of longevity payments for employees, and they built longevity increases into the pay scale. And so part of that pay that those employees are currently getting is longevity recognition. There is, through the discretionary performance incentive, you have the ability to recognize and increase the pay of an employee who is performing well and that you want to recognize, so better than their peers. But councils cap the amount that increase can be to no more than 4.5%. Like I mentioned before, there's the struggle with departments that don't have vacancies because it also has to be budget neutral. What I'm afraid that we're doing is we're perpetuating pay deficiencies. Because if I have a candidate that has a ton of experience that deserves to be hired at $25 an hour, but doesn't get it because we don't want to jump over somebody, that person's underpaid and now becomes our new ceiling for where we can hire at. So if we keep saying that our current employees are our upper limit, we're self-perpetuating paying too little. And at some point, we would need to break with that practice and start offering what we can offer when we're hiring new people. Now, I'm not going to lie, that would cause difficulties with the current people who got hired at less than they should have been. I would love to see a system where we can say we're going to magically change where everybody is. I don't know that the city can afford that. We are still working to implement option 3 from the wage study. So what happened when the wage study vendor came in was they looked at the time that you've spent with the city in your current jobs. So for example, they looked at me and they said, you're an HR director and you've been an HR director for the city for this amount of time. They figured out what I should be paid based on my experience just with the city. They didn't look at my previous HR experience or anything that I had coming in. When we implemented the wage study, we paid for people to be brought to where the study said they should be for anybody who was below midpoint. The city couldn't afford to pay to bring everybody where they were supposed to be who were above midpoint to maximum. What we've been doing over the last 3 wage studies, or the last 3 years since the wage study's been implemented, so in 19, 20, or maybe it was just 20 and 21. In 20 and 21, individuals who were still owed wage study increases under that third option have been stepping up to where they should be. I am concerned with if we put in a mechanism in place that says anybody who was hired too low gets adjusted, while our people who have been here for 10, 15, 20 years are still waiting to be adjusted from that last wage study. We've got a lot of pay priorities that we're working on balancing. I would recommend that if we're going to delve really deep into that, Mary Ann is much more expert on it than I am. But I have a real concern if we were to say like, okay, we want to address everybody who could have been brought in higher but wasn't, at the same time that those other people are still waiting for increases from 2019. And if we're going to make those types of changes for the utility, for fairness and equity purposes, I would want to look at that across the board. And that makes the number much more, the impact is greater, it's more people, it's more expensive. I also have a concern if we're talking about internal pay purposes. We're talking about a lot of special pay practices that we want to put into place for positions that, well, I believe if you ask me to look, are probably 100% held by males. And I am concerned that if we put separate pay practices in place for groups that we've cherry-picked, that we might be doing some gender pay inequities. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a reason why we pay vendors to do this stuff. And I'm a little concerned if we were to push up the wage study before the last one's been fully implemented, what the impact would be on those people with more longevity.
Mr. Robinson?
Where are we going with this? My concern, no offense, is that you're defending a situation or a system that worked well in the past. My concerns are the dynamics of today's economy demand a new thoughtful process and potentially an approach. And so how do we make ourselves competitive? If you look at the last 2 recruitments for the sewer maintainer recruitments, we had 4 candidates each round, 1 qualified. We're not attracting the good candidates. So what are the reasons why we're not attracting? We're attracting candidates, but we're not, and if we continue to maintain that 25% qualified, we're not going to have a very strong applicant pool. So I guess the question is what can we do as a commission to foster an environment that is encouraging diversity, to your point, in attracting the talent pool that we need to go forward. And I think that's what we would ask administration to bring back a recommendation and options going forward. We can have the debate over the present system or the future system, but that system is changing due to factors beyond our control.
Right. Do you think it makes sense to have a small work group kind of work this out? I don't know.
I'm not sure that this commission has the expertise.
Right.
So
I'm kind of looking at
I think we're
staff
looking
thinking.
for, I think we're looking for the people that have, we're looking for an HR perspective, a management perspective. There's some public sector and private sector people that we could, that they're groping with this issue as well. How are they approaching it? And we need to be more dynamic and quicker.
I saw you grabbing your
I
mic.
would like to hire a consultant to come in and be part of that group, that has expertise, that works with many other utilities, and give us options for our utility and how that looks, and so we're consistent across the board with how other utilities are dealing with this as well.
And the city. You can't leave that out.
Mr. Jean?
I'd agree with what John just said and what was suggested, but I think we ought to have a mechanism, if we have a person in place, to be able to get him up to at least equal to, because that doesn't make sense not to do that. Even though he didn't get that pay at the time he was hired. So somehow I like what John said, we have to revisit this, and we don't have a lot of time on our hands to make it happen either. So if staff want to talk about it and come back with some recommendations for us at the next meeting, I don't know how to, that makes sense?
Yep. Let's do it.
I think it's critical. We have to, and I can't disagree with, I know what the staff are like here. And it's not like Wausau's unique. It's every organization, municipal or private. We're all struggling with
It's a
that
little
same
different in
issue.
private business, just saying.
But he's here, right?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, I think we're ready to move on to item number 5. discussion and possible action on biosolid sampling plan for PFAS. Do you want to hit this, or?
Sure.
Thanks.
So there's been a lot of discussion about this with the commission here. People wanted to see potentially what this would look like if we move forward with this, if we didn't, if we waited for the regulations to come out. Is it worth it for us to be ahead of those? To be ahead of regulations can cause some issues. And so if we do come up with something, there's nothing regulated and we have to make improvements in order to address those, then those would not be covered once the regulations come in. So those would be on our own versus, when regulations come in, usually there's some cost share, some support fiscally with that. It is a real challenge right now because there's only recommended and essentially guidelines for doing it. Not only the testing, but how you sample. There's no guidelines as far as what the results will give you. And so, at this point, this is really coming up because right now we're land applying our biosolids and they're Class B, they're regulated by the DNR. So the DNR approves what land, what farms we put those on. We are going to a Class A, which is not regulated. So that material can basically go anywhere. We have people who are interested in it that'd be willing to come and pick it up for nothing. They'll come and take it, they'll use it. And so, there's a concern about if we're not for sure on where that's going, then are we holding liability? We haven't spoken with environmental attorneys or anything on it, but but it's basically a pass-through. When you talk with environmental engineers and you talk with, at least the engineering sector is that, and Kevin on our staff had made the same comment, very similar, that, it's there. We're not adding to it. We're just treating the wastewater. We've been land applying this stuff for decades. And there's the liability. It wouldn't necessarily come back on the municipality. But in a litigious society that we live in, if somebody came back, of course we'd be named as a utility, right? And so the question to the commission is this a route that you still want to pursue? Would you like me to have the DNR come in and talk, be on one of our future commissions? We know the guidelines that the DNR is using. Sampling and testing are the guidelines that Michigan used. And so when you ask them what should we follow, that's what they give us. They also have a guideline as far as what to do if you do have PFAS in your biosolids, and that's in your packet as well. So, will there be any ramifications for us? Will they require us to do anything if we find it? I don't know. They haven't been open to saying anything like that, so.
Mr. Robinson.
Well, thank you for doing this, but we didn't have most of the material that's in the packet today in our electronic packet. So it'd be nice to review those. I reached out to Darcy Pfas, the division administrator, and she gave me Jason Knutson, who's the wastewater contact for the sampling, who could perhaps shed some light, and I wasn't able to connect with him. I also reached out to Melissa Johnson to try to talk through the issue of biosolids. But I think that, remember that your liability associated with environmental issues arises out of 4 basic statuses or categories. You're the owner of the property, you're the generator of the material, you're the arranger of where that material went, or you're the transporter. I think we have some liability associated with the generation of that sludge cake or the biosolids or whatever you want going forward. And particularly if we're both generating it and transporting it and arranging for it to be spread in those fields, we probably are incurring some liability. So I think it's in our interest to try to understand what's there. We can then used as a defense. We didn't know it was there. We then began to look at the influent into the wastewater plant, work with the industries that were affected to try to reduce that influent so that both the effluent and the biosolids was reduced. I think the state's a ways off from developing those standards. They're probably, if I were to bet, given the current composition of the legislature, that you'll probably see EPA develop those standards first, which is, I think, not necessarily the best scenario, but we know that there will be a standard, and I think it's important for us to begin to understand what we're generating and work with the industries, if there are any. Not all waste streams have PFAS in them, and it depends on which PFASs you're looking for. But I'd like to continue it, and I can see if Mr. Knutson would be that person to talk to, if you wanted to bring him in at the future, but I just wasn't able to in the last 2 days to connect with him.
Yeah, I think the challenge is that obviously the municipality isn't creating these, right? And so without regulations, I mean, we can't require private industry to test. We can't require them to do anything. There's no regulations or guidelines out there for them. And so, and there's no limits for them. And so we would have to, chances are they probably, maybe they would allow us to test their waste stream. I don't know if they would. But even in our pre-treatment program, we can't require them to do that, these industries. So we would be testing on our line, which we can do, obviously, downstream from where those industries are if they don't allow us. So I think there's a lot of challenges with this moving forward. And of course, if we do find something, we can notify them, but we'd be relying on them to be able, to voluntarily do something, yeah. So, I just want to make sure that that's very clear, that, we're going down this road, that we don't really have any teeth on how to reduce this. We can identify essentially where possibly it's coming from, but there's really not a lot that we can do about it.
I'm not so sure we're as limited as you would portray, but I welcome a discussion
Yeah.
on that going forward.
And I think that's where the DNR has to be part of this discussion before this decision is made, because at this point, I don't think that I think we are limited. But if the DNR tells us differently, that would be, a good discussion to have.
So do we want to continue this, including the DNR, maybe at a future meeting? We keep, Mr. Jean, you looked like you wanted to say something.
Well, I'd rather they had the meeting with staff, and if one of the commissioners wants to be part of it, I think that would be in a public setting, to be honest, but that's.
Okay,
Sure.
we can do that.
Cool. Any other comments or discussion? Otherwise, I would entertain our last item on the agenda, a motion to adjourn. Looks like I have a motion from Robinson and a second from Herbst. We don't need to vote on this. We are adjourned. Thank you very much, everyone.